Welcome to Reformed Thinking, and welcome to The Deep Dive, where we take your source material and distill its most valuable insights, helping you grasp significant topics quickly and thoroughly. Today, we turn our attention to something truly central, to our understanding of God and our faith. We're taking a close look at a concept at the core of the Hebrew Scriptures, and fully embraced within Reformed theology. God as El Olam. This isn't just some, theological term. It actually tells us about who God is, his very character, and how that shapes pretty much everything we believe and experience as Christians.
That's right. Our sources for this deep dive are, well, they're wide-ranging. We're drawing from biblical texts, historical theological discussions, even contemporary analyses. Our goal today is really to unpack the meaning of El Olam, see how this idea unfolds throughout the Bible, how systematic theology brings it all together, how the church has held onto this truth through history, and maybe most importantly, what it means for your daily walk with God.
It's about understanding the everlasting God, sometimes called the mighty one of the age.
Yeah.
We want to see how this truth provides a stable anchor for our faith in a world that, let's face it, often feels quite unsettled. You'll hear about how God's self-existence and his unchanging nature make his promises completely certain, and why that matters so much for your own assurance.
Exactly. We'll follow this concept, tracing it from, Abraham planting a tamarisk in Genesis, all the way to the worshipful statements of Paul in the New Testament. We'll look at what El Olam tells us about God's fundamental qualities, how it supports core form doctrines like his eternal plan and the covenant of redemption, and how it shapes our understanding of Christ himself and his saving work.
We'll also examine some historical challenges to this understanding of God and how the church has responded over time, even looking at how this idea is discussed in modern theology. And finally, we'll draw out the real comfort and daily relevance this truth holds for you, whether you're worshiping God, dealing with suffering, or simply facing the everyday challenges of life.
Yeah, it's a look at why. Because God is El Olam, every promise he makes really does last longer than any fear we face. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's begin with the name itself, El Olam. It sounds powerful to even just hearing the name. What does El Olam literally mean?
Well, El Olam literally means the mighty one of the age. It's a compound name for God, meaning it's made of two parts. The first part, El, that's in Hebrew, it points to divine strength and God's absolute rule. It speaks to God's inherent ability, to act as he chooses without needing anyone else's permission or strength.
Okay, so El is about his might, his power. What about Olam? That's where the sense of time comes in, right?
That's right. The second part, Olam, in Hebrew, it brings to mind both an immeasurable past and an unending future. Think of it like a vanishing point on the horizon. Olam is what lies beyond any creature's ability to see or measure in time. Now, sometimes this word can describe a very long but still finite period like ancient times, but when it's connected with divine names like El or YHWH, its meaning really expands to limitless time.
So it's not just about a very, very long stretch of time then. It's something different in kind.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It signals a quality of duration, not just a quantity. God doesn't simply live longer than ages. He lives outside their flow. To speak of YHWH as El Olam is to know a God who utterly goes beyond the concept of duration itself. He exists in an eternal present where all moments, past, present, and future, are present to him simultaneously. He's just not constrained by sequences of time like we are.
Wow, that paints a truly vast picture. This idea sounds like it's woven into the very early stories of Israel. Where do we first see this specific name for God used in the Hebrew Scriptures?
Yeah, we see the first explicit use of El Olam in Genesis 21, verse 33. This happens when Abraham, after making a covenant and finding some security in the land God had given him at Beersheba, the text says he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God.
That specific setting in Genesis must tell us something significant. Abraham is settling into a new place, making arrangements with, well, human rulers.
Yeah.
What does calling on the everlasting God in that particular situation tell us?
It's very telling. Abraham's act of worship here, it's a public declaration. In a land full of shifting agreements and mortal rulers, where human deals could easily be broken, Abraham's confession shows that the stability of God's promise, the covenant to his descendants, it rests on YHWH's eternal faithfulness. It's not about human strength or temporary arrangements. It highlights that God's plans are anchored outside the fleeting nature of time.
Okay.
And this really sets a clear pattern for the rest of the Bible. Whenever Israel faces passing troubles, whether it's wandering in the wilderness, living in exile, or seeing human rulers falter, the prophets and poets bring up this idea of eternality to ground their hope again.
So it's a recurring theme, not just a one-off mention in Genesis. Can you give us some other examples of how this truth of El Olam appears throughout Israel's history in the Old Testament?
Oh, certainly. The Psalms contain some of the most striking expressions of this. Think about Psalm 90, often connected to Moses. It dramatically contrasts our brief human life, which fades like grass, with God's transcendence. It says, "Before the mountains were brought forth, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God."
That juxtaposition is powerful.
It is, and this vast difference between our short lives and God's unending nature, it leads to awe and that prayer for wisdom. Teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Another example is Psalm 102.27, where God is described as the one whose years have no end.
And what about the prophets, particularly when Israel was facing really hard times like the exile? Did they draw on this?
Oh, definitely. The prophets, especially Isaiah, frequently brought up El Olam to speak into those moments of deep uncertainty. Jeremiah 10.10 refers to YHWH as King of Eternity. And Isaiah 40.28, that serves as a strong answer to fears that maybe the gods of Babylon had overshadowed Israel's God. It proclaims, "The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary." This passage directly connects God's eternal nature with his inexhaustible life and, his endless ability to keep his covenant. It's a clear statement about God's unending might and reliability.
That must have given people such comfort during the exile. What other insights does Isaiah offer about El Olam?
Well, Isaiah 57.15 gives us another remarkable insight. It brings together God's transcendence and his compassionate nature in a beautiful way. It tells us that the high and exalted one inhabits eternity, yet simultaneously revives the heart of the contrite. Yeah, this shows that God's eternal nature isn't some distant, cold idea, but the very place from which God bends down in saving pity. He is both utterly beyond us and incredibly close. Isaiah 46.4 also speaks to this nearness, saying the everlasting God carries his people even to gray hairs, highlighting his care through every stage of life. And Isaiah 40, verses 6-8, provides that heartfelt contrast between fleeting human life, all flesh is grass, and the lasting word. But the word of our God will stand forever.
That's a really clear line from the Old Testament. So how does the New Testament take up and deepen this theme of God's eternality, particularly with the arrival of Christ?
The New Testament fully embraces and I'd say strengthens the idea of God's eternality. It shows both clear connection with the Old Testament and a definite climax centered on Christ. It doesn't weaken classical Jewish belief in one God. Rather, it takes it and includes it in a richer understanding of God's eternal glory, especially through the person of Christ.
Okay, can you give us some examples from Paul's writings? He often talks about God's eternal plans, doesn't he?
He does. Paul's doxologies, those expressions of praise, directly connect God's eternality to the gospel. In Romans 16.26, the gospel itself is identified as the revealing of the command of the eternal God, rooting the mission to all nations in a purpose that is literally older than creation.
So the gospel wasn't an afterthought.
Not at all. It was part of God's timeless plan. In a similar way, 1 Timothy 1.17 bursts forth in praise to the King of the ages, immortal, invisible, establishing the Church's worship language around these Old Testament ideas of God's eternal nature.
And then when we consider Jesus himself, the application to him must be quite striking.
It is. It's the most remarkable development, really. The New Testament applies El Olam directly to the Son, Jesus Christ. Consider just in 8.58 where Jesus makes that astonishing statement. Before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah.
This just compresses measures of time and declares his shared divine timelessness with the Father. He's not simply pre-existent. He exists outside of time altogether.
And John 1.1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That also points to this, doesn't it?
Absolutely. John 1.1 introduces the eternal Word who was with God and was God. It makes clear that this eternal logos entered time in the fullness of time, as Galatians 4.4 says. But crucially, he did so without giving up his divine timelessness. The incarnation is understood as something added, not something taken away, from Christ's divine nature. He took on humanity, but he remained fully God, eternally.
And this eternal nature of Christ seems vital for his work on our behalf for salvation.
Precisely. Hebrews 1.7-12 applies Psalm 102, which was originally about YHWH's unchanging eternal nature directly to Christ. It states that while the heavens will perish but you remain, this protects his ability to secure an everlasting covenant for his people, as Hebrews 13:20 puts it. His unending nature is what makes his saving work for us eternally secure. And his resurrection further seals this truth. Acts 2.24 says it was not possible for him to be held by death, because death is a temporal interruption incompatible with his indestructible life. Therefore, a believer's union with Christ means participating by grace in the life of the Eternal One. Our eternal security is found in his eternal being. Our salvation isn't just for a season.
It really sounds like the New Testament takes this idea and grounds it firmly within the very nature of God, encompassing the whole Trinity.
That's right. The New Testament includes classical Jewish belief in one God within a strong Trinitarian statement where Father, Son, and Spirit equally share eternal glory, like you see in Revelation 1.4-8. Eternity is understood as the shared life of Father, Son, and Spirit. The Father is the eternal source, the Son the eternal Word, the Spirit the eternal breath, yet there are not three eternal beings, but one God. This mutual indwelling, or perichoresis outside time, means that divine love comes before and gives reason for all created fellowship. Worshipful statements in Revelation, such as Revelation 5.33, rise to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever, including the Trinity in eternal worship.
So how does God's eternality relate to his plan for history and, well, for us?
Yeah, the New Testament consistently confirms God's eternal plan and foreknowledge, which rule all events. Acts 2.23 describes the crucifixion as happening according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. This wasn't a surprise to God, not plan B. Acts 17.31 states that God fixed a day when he will judge the world, showing his timeless rule over history and suggesting that conversion itself belongs to an eternal decree. Even the covenant of redemption, that internal agreement within the Trinity, was made before the ages began, as 2 Timothy 1.9 tells us. And Titus 1.2 speaks of eternal life, which God, who never lies, promised before the ages began. This means that history's unfolding is really the temporal carrying out of an unchangeable eternal decision. Nothing in time is outside of God's eternal design.
So it's more than just a theological idea. It's like an immovable pivot point for the entire storyline of salvation history. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yes, exactly. The biblical storyline, from creation all the way to the final resolution, is truly fastened to an immovable pivot point, Olam. Think about it. Creation itself is announced by the God whose years have no end. The covenants with the patriarchs, the prophetic declarations of restoration, the incarnation of the eternal word into human flesh, and the resolution of history in Revelation. All these things come from this eternal reality. Understanding it this way prevents us from just, proof texting verses out of context. Instead, it shows that God's eternal nature is Scripture's own explanation for why covenants don't break, why promises are certain, and why the Church's worship echoes ages of ages into the everlasting day. It's embedded in the Bible's inherent structure.
That's a truly strong framework for understanding the biblical narrative. Now, when we move from the biblical story to systematic theology, how does El Olam fit into a structured way of understanding God? How does it relate to his other attributes?
Well, El Olam really runs through every part of the Church's basic understanding of God's nature and actions. First, God's eternal nature secures his aseity.
Aseity, meaning he exists from himself.
Precisely. It means God has life in himself, as John 5.26 says, and exists from himself, ase. Eternity is the very mode or way God exists. He has no beginning, no growth, no decline, because nothing causes him or sustains him.
And this connects to his simplicity too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The idea that God isn't made of parts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Theity is closely tied to simplicity. The Westminster Confession of Faith says God is without body, parts, or passions. This means God isn't made up of separate qualities that add up over time. His very being is the same as his perfect qualities. So eternity isn't an extra feature. It's more like the boundless scope within which all those qualities simply are. His wisdom, his love, his holiness, they just are eternally. They aren't gained or developed.
So his simplicity protects his unchanging nature. That's his immutability, correct?
That's correct. Simplicity protects immutability. As actus purus pure act, God remains the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's Hebrews 13.8. This means every purpose that comes from God's will stands unchangeable. Why? Because a changing plan would imply a changing being, and God's nature does not change. He is the unchanging rock in the middle of a rusty river, while everything else shifts around him. And furthermore, God's infinity, his qualitative transcendence of all limits, is directly tied to his eternal, unchanging life. No created measure, whether of space, time, or even thought, can fully describe or contain him.
That's a really complete picture of God's being. How does this eternal nature of God, El Olam, influence our understanding of his activity in history, specifically his eternal decree and providence?
Because God is El Olam, His decree, his plan is timeless. It's not like a chronological first step he took ages ago, but rather it's the timeless reason for history's entire chain of causes and effects. The Westminster Confession 3.1 says, God hath foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. This means history's unfolding doesn't surprise God or cause him to make mid-course corrections, as we might say.
Right.
It is simply the temporal carrying out of an unchangeable eternal decision.
So what we see happening in the world, down to every detail, is the working out of this eternal plan, even the messy parts.
That's the classical understanding. Providence, as expressed in Westminster Confession v.1, is the working out of this decree in time. And this provides a deep sense of certainty. No event, no matter how chaotic it may seem to us, falls outside the everlasting God's wise design. This isn't fatalism. It's more like the assurance that an author's plot unfolds exactly as eternally conceived, even as the characters act freely within it.
That's a profound thought, definitely comforting in some ways. How does El Olam and this eternal perspective relate to God's covenants with humanity?
God's eternal nature is really the foundational principle of Reformed salvation teaching, or soteriology, the covenant of redemption, that agreement within the Trinity where the Father gives a people to the Son takes on their salvation, and the Spirit brings it about. The Bible tells us this was made before the ages began, citing 2 Timothy 1.9 again. This means that all the historical covenants we read about with Noah, Abraham, Moses, David are not separate trials or experiments, but progressive unveilings of a single heavenly design.
So when Scripture calls the gospel an everlasting covenant in Hebrews 13.20, it's not just being poetic.
Not at all. It's acknowledging that the benefits of the gospel, which are given in history, actually rest on agreements older than creation itself.
Wow.
This eternal foundation is why core beliefs like election, Christ's saving atonement, and the perseverance of the saints get their certainty from the unchangeable will of El Olam. It's all rooted in his unchanging character and purpose.
This all seems to come together so clearly in the person of Christ. How does El Olam specifically shape our understanding of Christ's person and the relations within the Trinity?
Indeed, Christ is the apex, the fullest expression of El Olam. The eternal Word, who was with God and was God, from John 1, entered time in the fullness of time without giving up his divine timelessness. Remember that phrase. The incarnation is an addition, not subtraction, to his divine nature.
Okay.
Think about this. Jesus could suffer hunger, thirst, and pain in his human nature, while at the same time holding up the universe as the everlasting God, as Colossians 1.17 suggests. His resurrection in Acts 2.24 further seals this. It was not possible for him to be held by death, because death is a temporal intrusion incompatible with his indestructible life. So a believer's union with Christ means participating, by grace, in the life of the eternal one. Our eternal security is grounded in his eternal being. The stability of our salvation rests entirely on who he is.
And the Trinity fits into this how?
All of this is completely Trinitarian. Eternity isn't some abstract quality of a single divine being, but the shared life of Father, Son, and Spirit. There are not three eternal beings, but one eternal God. Their mutual indwelling, that perichoresis outside time, means that divine love comes before and gives reason for all created fellowship. When those doxologies in Revelation 5.32 rise to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever, they're explicitly including the triune God in eternal worship. So to ignore or try to revise God's eternality is really to pull at a theological thread that, frankly, unravels the entire fabric of our understanding. But holding to it grounds every doctrine and every anxious heart in the unsearchable, unassailable life of the everlasting God. It's a bedrock truth that makes everything else stand firm.
It's certainly clear that El Olam forms a core part of Reformed theology. Now let's shift gears slightly and look at how this foundational concept has been understood and defended throughout church history. How did the patristic era, the early church fathers, grapple with and defend this truth against early challenges?
Yeah, the early church fathers consistently viewed God's eternality as central. They kept returning to El Olam whenever the lasting nature of the gospel was questioned. Justin Martyr, for instance, argued against a kind of philosophical fatalism by insisting that the God who created time also directs it toward a specific end, which preserved human moral responsibility.
Okay. And what about someone like Irenaeus dealing with the Gnostics? They had some pretty different ideas about God and time.
Exactly. Irenaeus made a similar argument against Gnostic ideas of dualism. He emphasized that because the Father is before all yet lovingly present in history, history can be neither just a meaningless cycle nor some tragic accident. There's a purpose to it all because an eternal God is guiding it. But a major shift in really articulating God's relationship to time, came with Augustine's Confessions, particularly Book 11.
Right, the famous "What was God doing before creation?"
That's the one. Augustine wrestled with that and suggested that created time itself flows from an eternal act of God. He famously said that God's now embraces past and future tota simultaneously all at once. This idea gave later theologians a powerful framework to affirm both God's absolute freedom and his meticulous providence, his careful guidance of all things.
Augustine's ideas certainly cast a long shadow.
Mm.
How did medieval scholasticism build on these foundations and refine the concept of God's eternality?
Medieval scholastics definitely refined Augustine's insights. Boethius famously defined eternity as the complete possession all at once of limitless life.
That's a classic definition.
It is, and Anselm later used that definition to uphold God's necessary existence in his ontological argument.
And Thomas Aquinas, he was obviously a towering figure in that era.
Aquinas, yeah. He skillfully brought together Boethian eternity with Aristotle's idea of actus purus, or pure act, in his system. He argued that because God is pure act and lacks any potential to become something else, he cannot be measured by movement or change, and is therefore not subject to temporal succession to moments following moments. Yet, Aquinas was also careful to protect God's free creation and sustenance of temporal beings without God himself becoming dependent on them or changing because of them. So by the time of the Reformation, God's eternity was really a settled truth of Catholic orthodoxy in Western theology.
Okay, so it was a well-established doctrine. How did the reformers, like Luther and Calvin, apply this doctrine, especially pastorally, for the comfort of believers?
The Reformers gave renewed pastoral emphasis to the doctrine. Martin Luther, for example, grounded the comfort of justification, our being declared righteous, in the eternal and unchangeable counsel of God. He argued that our assurance falters if we think God's purpose sways with human response. He directly connected assurance to God's unchanging eternal design.
That makes sense.
John Calvin, in his Institutes, gave a thorough explanation of God's transcendence, stating clearly that God's eternity contains the principle of immutability. This allowed believers, he argued, to rest on promises unaffected by the changes of time. Calvin also used God's eternality to counter charges that justification by faith was some novel idea, showing its grounding in God's eternal nature and plan. A generation later, you see the Heidelberg Catechism, question 26, bringing Reformation teaching in line with this classical doctrine, stating that God upholds and governs all things by his eternal counsel and providence.
It's clear this doctrine continued to be systematized and defended. How did post-Reformation theologians and later thinkers continue this defense, even up into the modern era?
Well, post-Reformation scholastics like Francis Turretin, who was arguing against Socinian views that questioned how an eternal God could truly act in time, he distinguished between God's immanent operations, his eternal decree, and his transient operations, the temporal carrying out of that decree. This helped preserve God's simplicity while still allowing for genuine novelty and action within history.
Interesting distinction.
Then you have figures like Stephen Charnock, whose work on the eternity of God explored how contemplating God's eternity nourishes devotion, using those wonderful biblical pictures like God being our rock and refuge. John Owen linked Christ's ongoing priesthood to his indestructible life, thereby grounding the perseverance of the saints, our continuing in faith in the everlasting Son's steady ministry for us. And of course, the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1646 codified this consensus view, stating God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, and his decrees are from all eternity.
And moving into the 19th and 20th centuries, as new philosophical challenges arose, did Reformed thinkers hold the line?
They did. Charles Hodge, for example, challenged emerging process philosophers by restating classic simplicity, arguing forcefully that a temporal God would necessarily be changeable and therefore ultimately unreliable. B.B. Warfield used Olam as a key argument for defending Christ's full divinity against liberal attempts to diminish it. Herman Bavinck, while engaging with new philosophical questions, still concluded that God's eternality is religiously essential because certainty about God's covenant collapses without it. More recently, John Frame has highlighted eternity's practical payoff. A timeless decree guarantees that God's promises come with a date already stamped sure they're not yet seen. And alongside this, you have things like the 2003 Alliance Confessing Evangelical statement, explicitly rejecting any view of God subject to temporal succession, echoing Westminster's language.
So it seems each era received and, in a sense, polished the confession of Olam.
That's a good way to put it. It demonstrates the resilience and theological fertility of this doctrine in guarding the gospel's permanence. The Church consistently understood that without an everlasting God, the gospel itself risks becoming just a fleeting hope.
That historical overview truly shows the steadfast defense of El Olam across centuries. But of course, theological ideas continue to develop and be debated. What are some of the modern theological views that challenge this classical understanding of God's eternality today?
Yeah, there are several modern theological approaches that either diminish or outright discard classical eternality. Probably the most prominent challenge comes from open theism, popularized by figures like Clark Pinnock and Greg Boyd. They argue that God is everlasting but not strictly eternal, meaning he endures through time, perhaps adjusts his strategies based on creaturely choices, and crucially doesn't know all future free actions of creatures exhaustively.
Okay, and what's the Reformed response to that idea? How does it stack up against Scripture and tradition?
Well, the Reformed response is multifaceted. First, it argues that open theism misunderstands divine authenticity, mistaking contingency for relational richness. Scripture grounds God's faithfulness precisely in his foreknowing sovereignty. Think of Isaiah 46:9-10, where God declares the end from the beginning, or Acts 2:23, showing the crucifixion happened according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Pastorally, open theism offers sufferers a deity who can only commiserate after the fact, potentially jeopardizing eschatological certainty, our hope for the future. Our intimacy with God in the Reformed view is based on a childlike trust that the Father's eternal plan holds every unknown tomorrow, not on mutual surprise.
So the argument is that if God doesn't comprehensively know the future, our hope becomes less secure. What about process theology? How does that view challenge El Olam?
Process theology, often associated with thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, sees God and the world as an organic, interrelated whole. In this model, God has a consequent pole or aspect that grows with each cosmic moment, absorbing value and thereby perfecting the divine life. Eternity in their system is perhaps one pole, but it exists within a larger temporal dynamism, meaning God himself is, in a sense, caught within the same temporal flux as creation.
That seems to change God's very nature in a fundamental way. He's becoming rather than being.
Exactly. Reformed thought argues that this view fundamentally equates mutability with richness, but a God who acquires perfection was previously imperfect, which is inconsistent with the biblical portrayal of the God whose name is I Am. Furthermore, if God is caught in the same temporal flux that includes the cross and resurrection, how can he be the ultimate ground of the cross's efficacy? Classical eternality affirms the triune Lord, eternally complete, enters history without forfeiting perfection, making his acts in time redemptive precisely because they originate from an unchanging eternal will.
Okay. Are there other, perhaps more nuanced views that still challenge God's timelessness?
Yes, some theologians who might affirm God's exhaustive foreknowledge still lean towards theistic presentism. This suggests that God exists within time, perhaps at every moment of time simultaneously, but still experiences intrinsic succession. It implies moments earlier and later inside the divine mind.
And what's the Reformed counter-argument to that idea of God having earlier and later moments within his own consciousness?
The Reformed tradition replies that succession, any kind of sequence, is foreign to the simplex divonus, the simple, non-composite God. A being whose inner states vary, even if only cognitively, is arguably composite and mutable. Seeing God as intrinsically temporal, even if everlastingly so, tends to dull the covenant's edge because a God who is undergoing temporal moments might imply a promise made today rests on a divine state that could, in some sense, differ tomorrow. The Westminster Confession's phrase, without body, parts, or passions, guards against such drift, affirming that the God who promises is his promise, eternally and unchangingly.
Right. And what about Molinism and the idea of middle knowledge? How does that fit into this discussion regarding eternality and God's decree?
Molinism, while often attempting to preserve God's timelessness and sovereignty, is sometimes seen by Reformed critics as introducing contingency into the divine decree in a problematic way. It proposes middle knowledge, a category of divine knowledge where God knows what any free creature would freely choose under any possible circumstance he could place them in. God then decrees the actual world based in part on this knowledge.
That sounds quite complex. What's the Reformed objection there?
Reformed theologians typically raise two main objections. First, the grounding objection. How can these counterfactual choices possess truth value independent of God's decree? If they do, it seems to posit truths outside of God, challenging his aseity. Second, there's a pastoral clarity objection. Assurance can feel like it collapses into fragile logic if God's ultimate plan leans on hypothetical human choices, rather than resting squarely on God's unconditional election flowing from an eternal decree. It shifts the ultimate ground of certainty away from God's sovereign will alone.
Okay, Stepping back from these more academic debates, how does the doctrine of El Olam speak to the broader cultural challenges we face today? Things like shifting identities and moral relativism.
That's a crucial question. In late modern culture, identity politics often prizes fluid self-construction, and therapeutic forms of spirituality sometimes seek a validating, evolving deity. Into this context, El Olam speaks a profoundly countercultural word. Remember Psalm 90.2? Before the mountains were brought forth, from everlasting to everlasting I am God. There's an objective reality there. Pastors and teachers have the task of translating this timelessness into existential balm, into real comfort and guidance.
How so? Can you give some examples?
Sure. Against the feeling of a chaotic society and rapid change, we can point people to El Olam, whose eternal decree choreographs even digital epochs. His plan isn't derailed by tweets or trends. Against the anxieties of aging and decay, we affirm that the Eternal One is not subject to entropy and secures for it fortifies assurance profoundly. Many believers wrestle with intrusive doubts, feeling their salvation is perhaps as unstable as their moods or circumstances. But if God elected us before the ages began, as Ephesians 1 says, and if his love is grounded not in our performance, but in his eternal, immutable nature, I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed, Malachi 3.6. Then a believer's standing cannot be undone by tomorrow's failures.
That's huge.
It is. Pastors teach the perseverance of the saints, not as a hopeful guess based on our willpower, but as the logical fruit of God's eternality. What the everlasting God has eternally willed, he will indefectibly finish, echoing Philippians 1.6. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. Counseling grounded in divine timelessness offers concrete comfort, the comforting thought that your name is graven on palms that do not wrinkle.
That's incredibly comforting. How does grasping El Olam enrich our public worship when congregations gather together?
Public worship gains, I think, a new texture, a deeper resonance, when congregations consciously sing, pray, and confess with God's eternity in view. Hymns like, O God, our help in ages past, or Immortal, invisible, God only wise, actively school the church's affections to savor a God who outlasts musical fashions, political regimes, and the rise and fall of empires.
Yeah, those hymns take on new weight.
They really do. And liturgists, those planning worship, can shape services to echo the biblical timeline: creation, fall, redemption, consummation, immersing worshipers in the story the everlasting God is writing across the ages. Even benedictions, when they speak of God from everlasting to everlasting, assure the saints that Monday's tasks unfold under the same eternal gaze that blessed Sunday's gathering. It connects our whole lives.
That adds a whole new dimension to our corporate gatherings. And what about our ethical resolve? How does El Olam sharpen our moral compass in daily living?
In a culture that often promotes fleeting truths or trends, meditating on God's eternal nature exposes these as mirages. It can liberate disciples from the tyranny of the now by encouraging us to live coram Deo before the eternal face. This has very practical outworkings. For instance, stewardship of time takes on a kind of sacramental weight. Each hour isn't just ours to kill, it's a gift from the timeless Lord to be invested wisely, prompting that prayer from Psalm 90.12, teach us to number our days.
Makes you think about how you spend your time differently.
Exactly. Even things like marriage vows gain gravity by mirroring an eternal covenant. Breaking them isn't just a personal failure, it's seen as a betrayal of the gospel story they signify. And our social justice work finds ballast. We pursue it not just because it's currently popular, but because the unchanging character of El Olam delights in steadfast love and justice, echoing Micah 6.8. Our ethics are grounded in who God is.
It provides a sure footing in a shifting world. How does this doctrine offer solace and perspective when facing suffering or the inevitable process of aging?
This is where El Olam offers profound comfort. For those dealing with chronic pain or wrestling with that cry, how long, O Lord? The ultimate answer isn't a timetable, but a person whose years have no end. Because God inhabits eternity yet stoops to dwell with the contrite, as Isaiah 57.15 says, sufferers can pour out lament without fear of exhausting divine patience or discovering God has moved on. He is eternally present to their pain.
That's a powerful comfort.
It is, and for aging congregants, perhaps feeling marginalized or useless, El Olam reminds them their worth is not indexed to vigor. The God who is their dwelling place in all generations, Psalm 90.1, promises to carry them even to gray hairs, Isaiah 46.4. Their value is secure in him. This allows funeral liturgies then to genuinely mingle tears and triumph, declaring the deceased body will be raised imperishable because it is united to an imperishable Savior. Hope is grounded in his nature.
That offers a true hope beyond our physical limitations and temporal struggles. Lastly, how does the doctrine of El Olam fuel mission and evangelism?
It provides both urgency and confidence, which might seem paradoxical but aren't. There's urgency because the everlasting God has fixed a day when he will judge the world, Acts 17.31. This implies that temporal windows for gospel conversations will close. We don't have forever in this life.
But there's also confidence.
Yes, immense confidence, because conversion ultimately belongs to an eternal decree. Missionaries and everyday evangelists are announcing a kingdom already secured in timeless counsel, not trying to build something based on a speculative future or merely human effort. This paradox, fervent pleading built on a certain outcome, rooted in God's eternal plan, allows believers to labor with tears and passion, yet also rest, knowing the everlasting shepherd ultimately loses none whom the Father has given him, as Jesus says in John 6.39.
That balance is key. And finally, how does this doctrine nourish the connection between generations within the church and families?
Yeah.
How does it foster continuity?
In things like family devotions and catechism, parents who grasp El Olam realize they are passing on truths older than their surname, rooting their children in the same grand narrative that steadied Abraham and thrilled Augustine. It connects them to something ancient and enduring. In an age marked by crumbling institutions and shifting loyalties, the church, by holding fast to this doctrine, models stability by rooting identity in El Olam, the unchanging God. Ultimately, ministry shaped by God's eternality cultivates a people who endure hardship with poise, celebrate joys without idolatry, lament losses without despair, and labor for holiness without hubris. Why? Because their lives are hidden with Christ in the bosom of the everlasting God, where no moth, rust, or revolution can sever the bonds of covenant love.
Wow, what a rich deep dive into the everlasting God. We've really gone from Abraham's confession at Beersheba all the way to the glorious vision of Revelation, seeing how God's eternality is truly the molten core of every biblical promise and every Reformed doctrine.
Indeed. To truly grasp El Olam is to plant your feet on a bedrock that neither the erosive winds of cultural limb nor the pounding surf of personal trial can dislodge. It means his covenant is inviolable, his providence is purposeful, and the salvation secured by the everlasting Son is, forever.
And what a comforting thought that is for you, our listener, especially maybe in a generation that can sometimes feel so restless and uncertain. Knowing that God's years have no end, that his faithfulness is unbroken, that his holiness stands unchanging, that's a truth that truly grounds everything else.
It really encourages us, doesn't it, to find the cadence of our laments in his unending patience, to make our ethical stands reflect his unchanging character, and to pursue mission with a focused urgency, because his everlasting kingdom is indeed near.
So as you go about your week, whether you're facing moments of joy or challenge, maybe consider this. How might living with the awareness of El Olam, the everlasting God, change the way you perceive your current circumstances and shape your hopes for what lies ahead? Thank you so much for joining us on The Deep Dive. We really hope this conversation has offered you clarity and encouragement. Until next time, keep seeking truth.